Thanks everybody for joining today. So I first wanted to start off talking about the relationship between factory farming and pandemics. And the first issue I'll point to is that factory farms themselves are breeding grounds for disease. Some of you may have seen the article title that I've posted here called "We Have to Wake Up, Factory Farms Are Breeding Grounds for Pandemics." It was published in The Guardian last month. And I just wanted to start off by reading one quote from the article. "Imagine that while your country practiced social distancing, your neighboring country responded to COVID-19 by packing citizens into gymnasiums by tens of thousands. Imagine if, in addition, they instituted genetic and pharmaceutical interventions that helped their citizens maintain productivity under such adverse conditions, even though this had the unfortunate side effect of devastating their immune systems. And to complete this dystopian vision, imagine if your neighbors simultaneously reduced their number of doctors tenfold. Such actions would radically increase death rates, not only within their country, but also yours. Pathogens do not respect species boundaries either. Influenza and coronaviruses move fluidly between human and animal populations, just as they move fluidly between nations. So when it comes to pandemics, there is not animal health and human health, not any more than there is Korean health and French health. Social distancing only works when everyone practices it, and everyone includes animals." So the article goes on to further discuss in more detail and scientific terms how factory farming, and specifically industrial chicken farming, poses a severe risk to our public health, including the link between factory farming and animals and previous disease outbreaks we've seen, such as swine flu and avian flu. But the moral of the story here is that we can't keep farming billions of animals each year and expect not to have diseases transferred to animals, from animals to humans. And then another point I wanted to touch on, aside from the public health risk poultry farming poses to the public, worker safety is also a huge issue right now. I'm sure many of you have seen articles published in recent months about issues surrounding slaughterhouse workers. And to keep in mind also, a large percentage of slaughterhouse workers are people of color and people living in low-income communities. A line from this article here, from the article, "Missouri Pork Plant Workers Say They Can't Cover Their Mouths to Cough," says, "Workers at Smithfield Pork Plant in Milan, Missouri say that for years they have endured repetitive stress injuries on the meat processing line and urinary tract infections because they've had so few bathroom breaks. But as the coronavirus pandemic has emerged, workers say that they have encountered another health complication: reluctance to even cover their mouths while coughing or clean their faces after sneezing, because this can cause them to miss a piece of meat as it goes by, which creates a risk for disciplinary action." So these lines are moving so fast that they don't even have time to cover their mouths, which, as you can imagine, leads to the outbreaks that we've seen, such as 58% of workers at a Tyson meat factory in Iowa testing positive for coronavirus, and other plants having to shut down due to worker conditions. So with all of this new information coming out, I think as a nation and even globally, we have this opportunity to collectively re-examine how dangerous our industrial meat system actually is for animals and for humans. And a third point in terms of the environment, this is a perspective from Dr. Aaron Bernstein, who is the interim director of Harvard University Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment, wrote a great article that tackled a lot of interesting questions about the relationship between climate change and the coronavirus. And he makes the point that large livestock farms can serve as a source for spillover of infections from animals to people. Less demand for animal meat and more sustainable animal husbandry could decrease emerging infectious disease risks and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So going back to the article I quoted a few slides earlier, this article ends by saying, "It can feel wrong or simply impossible to focus on anything other than getting through this most challenging moment. But the vulnerability that makes the present so painful is exactly why some discussions cannot wait. The suffering we stand to reduce or increase by threads of action that we begin to unwind now could be magnitudes of what we're currently experiencing." So I just want to wrap up this section, and then Hannah and I will get into some more concrete strategies by saying that this is really a moment where change is possible, and which talking about our food systems now with our universities, workspaces, communities is so, so important. And so we're excited to give you some tools in order to help you achieve that within your advocacy. So with that, I will hand it back over to Hannah.
Thank Thank you, Alana. That was awesome. So yeah, as she mentioned, this is something that's very important, also something very timely and something that affects everybody across the world. We all like to say in our work that you eat usually 3 times a day, sometimes more. So every time you sit down to eat, you have an opportunity to make an impact and make a choice to help solve a problem that we have seen. So we want to give you some tools and talk about our different approaches to this. No approach is right or wrong. They can go hand in hand if you want to work on both of them. And we're happy to work with all of you on that and give you some help and guidance. So let's see, let me get my screen up here for you all. So first, I just want to talk about what FFAC is. That is the organization I work for. So that stands for Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, and we help run the Green Monday program here in the United States. So our mission is to inspire and empower individuals and institutions to create a more just, compassionate, and sustainable food system. And I have our outline of strategy here on the screen for you to see. So we focus on, first of all, raising awareness and providing education through our presentations that we do in classrooms and for businesses, as well as local community groups. And we do that through a bunch of different ways to help mobilize them. So we work on mobilizing activists through programs like I'm going to talk about, through internships, trying to engage the community, institutional change, which is where the Green Monday program comes in, and also working to increase demand for those plant-based options. So we want to make sure that people feel inspired and encouraged and empowered to eat a more plant-forward diet through the education and the institutional change that we provide. So we have a really interesting way of looking at this. We call it green synchronization. So our theory is that small changes over time can make a big difference. And we look at this in 3 different ways. So the first way is a routine-based approach to this. So we think about leaving animals off your plate in a routine way. So that could be, you know, on Mondays, I'm not going to eat meat or cheese, whatever you want to, however you want to incorporate that into your diet. You could also do it 1 meal every day. So maybe, you know, I'm not eating animal products on my dinner every week, every day of every week. I'm not going to eat animal products. And that's a great way to get started in this. Another way we look at this is through a portion-based approach. So when we look at this, we want to think about reducing the portion sizes of animal-based foods. So if you're eating a burger or a big piece of chicken or a steak with every meal plus cheese and maybe like a glass of milk, maybe just work on starting with reducing those portions. So maybe you have, you know, a smaller piece of chicken, you remove the cheese from your plate, or you eat it less often. So trying to reduce the amount that we're eating. And also impact-based. So another way of looking at this is you could think about foods that have the largest footprint or negative impact on the environment, on workers, on animals, whatever, however you view this as working. We try to look at it very holistically. So I think most people are aware that red meat is incredibly harmful for the environment, not only with the amount of resources that cows consume, but also their emissions of methane. So maybe you start there. Maybe you start by eliminating red meat and dairy, since both of them come from a cow. Therefore, you're eating less impactful food with your diet. But these all can work together. And so we work on this in a very holistic way, and we try to make sure that the groups that we work with feel very empowered to make these choices. So the first thing when we work with an organization or a school or a community group is we sit down and we really try to figure out, what does their food system look like? Do you have a cafeteria? Do you have more of a potluck style, maybe following, you know, a faith meeting, church on Sunday, synagogues, anything like that? We try to figure out, when are you eating and what does that look like? And then we want to work with you to help introduce more plant-based foods into that eating, and also take out some of the more animal-based foods. So that's the first goal, is to remove those meat and dairy products in dishes where a plant-based option can be easily used. So one example that I like to do with schools is if your school is serving beef nachos, maybe the cheese is something you can't afford or budget for plant-based cheese at the moment, but it's really easy to switch out that beef or chicken on the nachos for beans. And that's a really simple step, but it makes such a huge impact. So we try to find those places and those small little areas that actually make a much larger impact. We also really like the idea of labeling these foods as a sustainable option rather than an alternative. So we will work with schools or local community groups to label these plant-based dishes as the green option, the sustainable option, a sustainable food, something along those lines that entices people to try the food. You don't have to label it as vegan. You don't have to label it as an other. It is a sustainable food inherently. So encouraging people that way and reframing the way they see this normalizes the idea of plant-based eating. It also encourages people to try it. People who may not otherwise think about eating vegan or vegetarian foods feel more open to this when they see that framing. And the biggest thing we really work on is the education. So we want people not only to make this choice and choose these foods, but understand why they're choosing it. And FFAC provides presentations that do this, but you can do this a number of ways. You can put up posters, you can host documentary screenings, you can have staff meetings, anything you can do to educate your community or your staff or your students on why this is so important is key. So the framework of today's webinar is mostly on community groups and households. So this could just be sitting down with your church group or your Mothers Against Drunk Driving group or whoever it is, even your household, and watch a documentary, watch something like Forks Over Knives or Food Inc., or read an article as a family. Alana mentioned a lot of really great articles in her section. Just sit down and educate yourself. So the next time you see an option that is plant-based, maybe you'll think, this is actually something I want to support. This is something I feel is the right choice, and I understand why. So here's some different ways that this could look. I took this image off our website, so if you want to find it, you can find it there, and I'll have that listed at the end of the webinar. But these are some different ways that this can look. So if you have a potluck type style of eating with your community group, you can request that everyone bring a plant-based food, or if one family is in charge of the food every week, you can, and you're the one in charge, you can make an entirely plant-based food spread for the potluck. You can also educate the people in your group, whether those are guests or members or congregants, on the devastating impacts of that industrial animal agriculture like we just talked about. And on our website, we have really great resources available that are free use. You're welcome to use them if you want to hang up posters or use a trifold brochure in your community group. You can further talk about how factory farming violates your faith's traditions, or how it violates the tenets of your group or your family. If you feel, abusive workers is inherently wrong, then maybe we shouldn't be eating foods, or trying to be more conscious of the foods we eat to make sure that people aren't being affected, just like animals aren't being affected. So here's an example of a poster we have available on our website. This one discusses the difference in the amount of carbon dioxide emitted per 1 pound of food. So I put this up here just to show the impact that this can have. So can you imagine you walk into, we'll just say a potluck with your community group. You walk in and this poster is hanging on the wall in the room where you're having your potluck, and you walk up and there's an option to have a burger, but then there's also all of these plant-based foods along with it. And you see this and you say, wow, if I eat this tomato or this tofu or this bean salad, my amount of carbon dioxide being emitted from my food is substantially less than if I pick up this burger. So something as simple as this can make a huge impact without you actually having to do a lot of work. People are able to recognize that this is a much better option, and they feel like they're making the choice and they're empowered to do so. And I wanted to mention this as well to tie in our work as well as with what the pandemic discussion was earlier. And this act has been requested in Congress to be enacted. And I put some of the tenets here of what this act would require or request within the government. And it's a little unsure, maybe unlikely that this is going to get passed. But if we normalize plant-based eating and we empower people at the community level in our households, we start at the lower levels, and we, through that, feel encouraged and empowered ourselves, we can then push it and push the importance of that onto our legislators that we're voting in. And something like this act, if a lot of people feel more connected to this movement and they understand the impacts that an act like this would have, something like this may not be far off to pass in the next 5-10 years, which would be really wonderful, not only for animals and our health, but also for the health of the planet, which we know ultimately is the main goal. So here is some of our contact information. I have both of our websites for FFAC as well as Green Monday and my contact information. So feel free to screenshot this or jot it down really quickly if you'd like. We'll also be sending out follow-up email that will include all of this. So if you miss it, it's okay. And I'm going to give just a minute for you all to write this down. And again, if you have any questions for me or for Alana from the pandemic section at this point, you can put them in the Q&A section of Zoom and we'll get to them at the end. So thank you all, and I will pass this back to Alana.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, are my slides showing up okay? Great.
Yes.
So now to get into Default Veg, some of you may have heard about Default Veg before, some not. It is the very simple idea of asking institutions, organizations, events, conferences, gatherings, any setting to just serve plant-based meals by default and have diners opt into serving animal products instead of the reverse. So a typical example of this is when you're going to a wedding or an event and you have a little registration form and they normally ask, do you want the chicken, the beef, the fish, or the vegetarian, plant-based, vegan option, which normally isn't even written out, which I'll get into in a little bit too when we're talking about labeling. Just flipping that idea on its head and offering deliciously described plant-based options as the default, and then continuing to give diners the choice to opt into meals with animal products if they would like. So you're preserving their freedom of choice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food trends, behavioral nudges, how those two come together to create Default Veg, and then some research that's been done about defaulting to plant-based in dining settings, how to implement Default Veg in your communities, what impact it has on food waste, climate change, and public health, and then some resources, and then we will jump into some questions. So to get started with food trends, plant-based eating has been one of the top food trends over the past few years, as I'm sure many of you know. So basically to say it's not a fad, it's here to stay, and multiple news sources and consulting agencies have confirmed this. And even Aramark and Sodexo, some very large food service providers, have been implementing more plant-based options into their dining halls and into their food service recipe collections in order to meet demand. And even the CEO of Danone, which is one of the largest dairy companies in the world, has actually bought Silk and Vega, which are two plant-based protein brands. And he says there is a huge trend of people moving to less animal protein and more vegetable protein all across the world. And we believe that this flexibility in diets is fundamental for the future, for the health of our people and also the health of the planet. So it's definitely an issue that's coming to light more and more every year. But I often get asked the question, you know, if we just offer plant-based dishes, is there going to be demand for it? Are omnivores going to want to eat more plant-based foods? And the answer normally is yes. So Emma Garnett and her colleagues at the University of Cambridge collected data on more than 94,000 meals sold in 3 cafeterias at the university in 2017. And what they found is that when the proportion of meatless options doubled from 1 to 2 out of 4 choices, so instead of 1 plant-based option out of 4 to 2 plant-based options out of 4, overall sales remained constant, but the sales of meat-containing meals dropped and the sales of vegetarian meals rose from 40 to 80%. So that's just to show that if you offer plant-based options, as long as they're deliciously described and they taste good, more people are going to want to try them and expand their horizons. And this is just some other data on a lot of 60% of Gen Zers want to eat more plant-based food, and 90% of consumers who buy plant-based meat also buy animal-based meat. So that's just to show that people who have grown up eating animal meat their whole lives have now transitioned into trying plant-based meats, which is on the rise too. So some of you may have heard of Richard Thaler. He is a professor and the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. And he wrote the best-selling book, Nudge, which is about helping people make better decisions using nudge theory. And what he observed is that inertia or inaction, when it limited our our participation in beneficial programs like retirement savings plans or school lunch programs, Professor Thaler proposed that governments and employers should make participation the default option. So people are free to opt out, but the inertia is in the side of the preferred outcome. So it's just saying, let's make the right choice, the choice that's better for our health, better for our children, better for the planet, the easy choice. And defaults have been proven to work in many other settings as well. One of the most successful examples is organ donation, where the default is that if you're automatically an organ donor, a lot more people are going to stay organ donors, whereas if you have to opt in to become an organ donor, not a lot of people are going to take that extra step because there's that thought process involved. And so in Austria, where you have to opt out, 99% of people are organ donors. In Germany, when you have to opt in to become an organ donor, only 12% of people do it. And that's not saying that there's good people in one country and bad people that don't want to help others in another. It's just the power of the default option. And this is shown across the board. So as you can see, all the countries on the right side here have an 86 to 100% rate of people being organ donors because it's the default option. And on the left-hand side, you see a less than 30% rate of organ donors because they have to opt in and take that extra step to become one. So putting those two ideas together about how powerful defaults are as a nudge and that plant-based eating is growing and trending every year, you get Default Veg. The concept, as I described at the beginning, is just to offer plant-based meals by default and give diners a choice to add in meat and dairy to their meals upon request, and there's different ways to do that. It's really simple and easy for catering, for conferences, dining facilities, office meetings. And one of the biggest points here is it's inclusive. The majority of people, if not everybody, can eat plant-based meals. Yes, you're going to still have to deal with certain allergies, which you'd have to worry about if you're an event planner for any sort of meeting or gathering, but there won't be people opting out of a plant-based meal because of dietary restrictions, that they don't eat fish or meat or dairy, or they're lactose intolerant or have a shellfish allergy, etc. So it actually makes it a lot easier to serve food this way too. And this could be cost neutral or even save you money depending on what you're serving, and it has a significant impact on carbon emissions reduction. So getting into some research, this is a study, hold on 1 second. This study consisted of an experiment at Harvard in which two groups of conference participants were presented with different default meal selections. When registering and selecting their meal preferences, a control group of participants were presented with a choice of meat and fish as the default, and they had to indicate if they wanted the plant-based option. And then in the other group, they were given a plant-based option by default and had to opt in for meat. So as you can see here, when offered a meat default, 75% of people went with the default meat option. And when you switch the default option to veg, only 33% choose the meat option. So that's a 40% increase in the amount of plant-based meals served, which is huge, and we think this could be even bigger. And if you implement, a Meatless Mondays policy for catering, that's about a 20% increase in plant-based meals 1 day a week. If you do default veg every day, it has the potential to be even more than that. And so this was another peer-reviewed study that was conducted in Denmark in 2017, which found an even greater success rate in switching the default option on the registration form to veg meals. And in the 4 trials they conducted, they found up to an 85% increase in the amount of veg meals served just by changing the default again. So as you can see here, in all of the groups across the board, you're seeing approximately an 80% increase in the amount of veg meals served, again, just by switching that little text on a registration form, which is pretty crazy. And yet another example of this is the city of Ghent adopted a campaign where they made vegetarian meals the default option just on Thursdays in its 30 publicly funded schools. So if students wanted meat on those days, or if their parents insisted that they have it, they could, but they had to signal it beforehand. And the result is that 94% of students were eating vegetarian on Thursday because the default option was changed. So in terms of implementing default veg, I would love to go over a few examples with you all first. If anyone wants to write in the chat box or in the question box, what are a few things that you see that might be wrong with this menu description, as you can see on the left-hand side here? And Chris will read out some thoughts from the audience.
All right, I see one answer, or a couple answers. Katrina says using the word vegan can have negative connotations for some. Elizabeth says discourages the vegan option.
Yep.
Howard says the vegan option is not described. Craig, no one wants an unknown meal.
Yep. Exactly.
Hannah says the vegan option provides no description. Joseph, number 3 looks very unappealing, no description. And Ashley, I have little idea what I'll be eating if I choose vegan, so less likely to choose that.
Great. Awesome. Those are wonderful responses. I think you got all of them, which is first, the vegan option is last. So if you put something at the bottom of a menu, people are going to have to read all the way down to get to it. So you always want to put your plant-based options first. The second, I think someone noted this, that vegan means it's othering. It means different from me. So if you don't identify as vegan, it's unlikely you're going to select a meal choice that just says vegan entree. And then third, there isn't a description. Like a few of you pointed this out. If you're you're not going to choose a meal that isn't described about what it is unless you absolutely have to eat it. And so I think all of these are important examples. This was an actual menu I received once, and I was like, this is just not the way to have a menu if you want people to choose more plant-based options. And then one other question. This was a study where research assistants monitored the number of diners who chose green beans and the amount of green beans that were consumed over the course of each lunch period for an entire academic quarter. That was over 40 days. There were no changes to how the food was prepared or presented throughout the study, but which option do you think, A, B, C, or D, got selected the most based on its title? So you can write in the chat box for this one as well.
And on that last question, Joseph mentioned another thing. So even if you're vegan, you need to know what's in it, especially in case of allergies, etc.
Definitely, yeah.
So we got lots of D answers coming in, the sweet sizzling beans. Everybody's on.
Very smart. Everyone's on D?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. So they found that labeling vegetables with indulgent descriptions resulted in 1, more diners choosing the vegetable itself, and 2, an actual greater mass of green beans served each day. So that just goes to show you how important it can be to make sure that you are labeling your plant-based options deliciously, because we like to have comfort food and indulge in what we're eating, and vegetables can play that role. This is a slide that I love to show also about menuing. This is a study the World Resources Institute did that shows the menus have the exact same options on the left hand and the right side, but when you actually incorporate the veg options into the menu itself, so as you can see here, it's the first and the last option versus on the menu on the right, the 2 veg options are at the bottom in their own section. People are much more likely to order plant-based dishes. And then these are just some general language usage terms overall, to not use words like meat-free or meat-less, like you're taking something away from the diner. You do want to make sure people know that the meal is vegan or vegetarian, but you can do that like it shows here by highlighting at the end of the description, like a little V in parentheses, instead of labeling the entire entree vegan this or vegetarian this. And then healthy restrictive, as you saw here, that was actually option B here was the one that got selected the least. So you never want to tell people like low sodium, low carb. That actually normally makes people want to eat less of it because they don't think it'll taste as good. But what we do want to use is the provenance or the origin of where the food came from, like Cuban black bean soup instead of just low sodium black bean soup. A lot more people are going to want to try it. And then talking about the flavor and the look and the feel of the food is important as well. So in terms of implementation, these are the 3 main ways to help kickstart Default Veg in your community, depending on what organization you're working with. So for universities and just communities in general, we really want to hone in on cafes to start by asking them to offer their plant-based milks by default in the drinks. For conferences and events, and ask, even if you were working on with a conference this year and they've been postponed to 2021 or 2022, now is a great time to ask them to help align their food choices with their values and offer Default Veg menus for their upcoming conferences, because you can get in there now and change the registration form so it's all set up for when they do offer the conference in the future. And then if you're working at an office or part of an organization, you can ask them to adopt Default Veg for all of the meetings and events they're going to host in the future. And we provide free consulting and we'll help you write a little description that shows why that specific organization or office is adopting Default Veg. Maybe it's for sustainability reasons. Maybe it's for social justice values. Maybe it's for animals. Maybe it's for public health. A lot of folks that are coming back into offices are seeing a bunch of measures being taken to protect your public health, right? So you're having maybe glass put up in between desks and hand sanitizer and masks and all these things, but maybe your office hasn't thought about, well, if this food is going to potentially contribute to a future disease outbreak or pandemic, maybe we want to put something in place that shows that us as an office and an organization are not going to support an industry like that for our food. And then this is another option for restaurants. People always love to ask, can I do this at a restaurant? Definitely. This is one way to do it, by having your menu be plant-based by default and saying all dishes are prepared plant-based unless otherwise marked, versus, having the little veg section in the corner. And then this is a retail dining facility at Cal Dining at Berkeley, where they have it's by price, which is the difference here. So the traditional plate, which is an entree choice and 2 plant-based choices, is $12. And then on the right-hand side, the plant-forward sampler plate is only $6. So the more plants you're eating, the cheaper the meal is. And then just to finish up here with some impacts, first in terms of our health, we calculated a menu analysis where we took a basic breakfast, lunch, and dinner menu from like a big conference or event, comparing a tofu scramble to a cheese omelet, a yogurt parfait to a vegan yogurt parfait, things like that. And what we found is that on average, plant-based meals have 7.5 fewer grams of saturated fat. And the American Heart Association recommends eating no more than 13 grams of saturated fat per day. So that's more than half the amount of saturated fat you're saving eating plant-based meals on average. They have less sodium, less cholesterol, because plant-based meals don't have any cholesterol, and only 2.5 fewer grams of protein across the board. So if anyone's ever saying, where do you get your protein? Typical question, or are plant-based meals going to have enough protein? Yes, they are. And in terms of climate, we know that livestock is responsible for at least 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is the same as the entire transportation sector, but they're also responsible for a lot of water and land use as well. So as you can see this divide down the middle, to the left-hand side, you're seeing the impact of plant-based foods. To the right-hand side, you're seeing the impact of animal-based foods. And you can just see in terms of land use, water consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions across the board, animal-based foods use a lot more of those resources. And I normally talk about this in terms of universities and schools, but this can also be used in any setting. If your budget has been cut for sustainability for this year in light of COVID and anything else going on, eating more plant-based meals is a way to continue to reduce your carbon emissions that isn't going to cost anymore. So maybe you can't get those solar panels, or you can't change light bulbs, but this is a free, cost-neutral way to reduce your carbon emissions that doesn't require any extra effort, just changing a menu or changing the meal options you offer. And then the last point I'll make about food waste before we jump into some resources and questions are that a lot of folks I work with are really into composting, which I think is awesome, But with food waste, one step back is looking behind the scenes at looking at what you're purchasing and seeing how much food is actually wasted before that meal even gets to your plate. So something about the chicken industry, we slaughter over 9 billion chickens in the US every year, and 5% of them die before they even make it to the slaughterhouse. So 5% aren't even, making it to the point where they can be used for production. 5% or more have something that's called spaghetti meat or woody breast syndrome, where the meat on the chicken is either too stringy or too tough because of the way that we've genetically modified the animals over time. And so you can't use that either. So at least 10% of our 9 billion chickens, which is 900 million birds, are being wasted each year before they even get to the grocery store. So that's not even talking about the amount of food that's wasted after we ordered meals and have to throw food out. So one thing I like to bring up to people when I'm talking about going default veg or just reducing meat consumption in general is just pulling our dollars out of this industry is saving so much from food waste too. And as I mentioned before, the Default Veg team provides free consultation to any person, any advocate, institution that wants to needs assistance with implementing Default Veg, whether that be being on a conversation with your food service provider or helping you with menu creation. We'd love to help with any of that. And we have a bunch of materials, some recently developed. We have a one-pager for offices and conferences and to help students with talking to their dining hall on campus to make it easier for you. And we have a great recipe tool on the Default Veg website if you want to check it out that has over 10,000 plant-based recipes. So this is just a great tool even for at home right now. If you're looking for a plant-based version of your favorite recipe that might normally have animal products, you can just type it in and see what comes up. And then we recently launched the Default Veg Ambassador Program, which is basically just a way for anybody in their community to become an advocate for Default Veg. So if you want to help your office or an event at your campus or a conference become Default Veg, you can sign up to become a Default Veg Ambassador, and then we'll work more closely with you to help you do that and recognize you for it. So just to end here, I hope that you've learned something from Hannah and I about some new strategies and ideas that you can bring back to your community or to your campus. And when we go back to having events and gatherings, we will have this really cool opportunity to create a new, sustainable, plant-based, healthy normal. And I hope you'll all be a part of advocating for that. So with that, that's my contact information, which we can send out as well, and we can open it for questions.
All right, I'll turn on my video so I'm not just a voice. Okay, so we have a couple questions coming in. The first one is from Howard, and it says, with this animal product by impact thing, many more chickens are tortured and killed per unit animal than cows. So it takes a lot more chickens to produce the same amount of meat than it does using a cow. So his question at the end is, so if you start out worried primarily about ecology, start by replacing beef with plant-based options. If you start out worried by abusing and killing farmed animals, start by replacing chicken with plant-based options. But suggesting that we replace beef with chicken or chicken with beef might be problematic. Do you, Alana or Hannah, have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can speak for FFAC and Green Monday. We never advocate for people to do that. We just like people to look at the impact of food as a whole. So if someone isn't fully ready to never eat meat again, we want to ease them into that. So whether that for them is a step-by-step, okay, I eat beef, turkey, chicken, and pork, right? So they ultimately want to get to the goal of not eating meat at all, which is great, and we support them in that. Some people may do that through those different ways that I talked about. So some people may do it by, okay, I'm going to start by not eating meat at all on Mondays, and over time they build that up until they're not eating it at all. Other people, it works for them to look at what foods have the biggest impact and eliminate those first and work through eliminating all of them. So it's never replace this with that, unless it's replacing this, which is animal products, with that, which is plant-based products. So that slide, I probably could have been a little more clear on that. Yeah, it's never about replace beef with chicken. That's just one method in starting that reduction, starting that way of normalizing eating plant-based for yourself or your community. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, we never would advocate for people to eat chicken over beef, ever.
Yeah, and the executive director of Farm Forward earlier this year actually got an op-ed published in the New York Times in response to an article that actually said that, that was saying, you know, if you want to cut out beef, move towards fish and chicken. And we were like, no, that's not what to do. So we're definitely involved in that conversation too on a larger scale to make sure that that is not the option that people are going towards. And also a point to bring up if you're ever in a conversation is the impact I talked about at the beginning with public health. Chickens are probably the worst thing to eat in terms of future disease outbreak and pandemic risk. And as you mentioned, we also, from an animal perspective, they're one of the most affected. So yeah, there's a couple of points to bring up there if you're ever in that conversation with somebody.
Awesome, thank you both. All right, and Joseph has a kind of clarifying question. He was asking about when it says alternative production methods, that means alternative meat production or switching to plant-based farming instead. I think, was that you talking about that, Alana?
I don't think so.
Maybe. Joseph,
would you mind clarifying if that was for a particular slide or question?
I might be able to find you and unmute you too, Joseph.
That was, from the bill, okay.
So let me see, I'm going to find the part of it so I can read it for everyone. So it says, provide $100 billion over the next 10 years to assist farmers with buyouts and debt forgiveness, as well as helping former CAFO owners transition to alternate production methods. Yes. So what that means is they're trying to first give money to assist the farmers with buyouts for their debt. So a lot of times the smaller farms that feed into those bigger CAFOs, which if you're not familiar, means concentrated animal feeding operation, which is usually the horrible images of animals that we're all used to seeing. Those are the typical CAFOs. So a lot of the times those smaller farmers that provide those animals to those larger facilities, they're incredibly in debt to those larger companies. And that's what keeps them tied into the system. So they first want to help bail them out so they're no longer in debt and they have a little bit more freedom to do what they need to do. The second piece of that, yes, Joseph, is they want to help transition farmers into farming plant-based foods. So a few things that I've seen around my area in Virginia is they're trying to put money into a program that would help transition the chicken and pig farmers, because we have a lot of both of those animal production facilities, give them money to grow hemp, to grow soybeans that would then go, or peas, that would then go to help make those plant-based protein alternatives. So yes, it's just a different way, and it's to keep them farming because most of them have the land and the equipment. It's just using the existing land and the equipment in a different way. Yeah, great question.
Great, and it looks like I don't see any other questions right now. We can give people another second. But is there anything else that you guys would like to wrap up with or give people action items on, things they can do to follow up with this?
Yeah, so in a follow-up email, we'll, as Chris said, we'll be sending out a recording of this presentation, so feel free to share it with anybody. And then I'll also be sending a couple of Default Veg materials, just a one-pager and a resource guide, along with a link to if you want to sign up to become a Default Veg ambassador. So if you or anyone you know is interested in that, that's a great way to move forward and help your community.
Yeah, thank you, Alana. Yeah, we'll also be sending out some information about FFAC as well as Green Monday and providing different ways to get involved. So we call it starting a team or starting a campaign. So that just means that you want to implement this type of theology into whatever you're working on with your community group or your faith organization. We'll be doing a follow-up webinar to this focused a little bit more on like corporation level, university. So we do that as well if that's something that you're interested in. Yeah, we'll also send out that as well. But I just want to reiterate, I don't know if we said it before, but Alana and I, Green Monday and Default Veg work very closely together. So we're more than happy if you like some of what Green Monday does, some of what Default Veg does, we're more than happy to work with you and help merge it together. So yeah, don't feel like you're like pulling sides. Yeah, we definitely work very collaboratively and these two can play into each other very well. So just wanted to reiterate that.
And sometimes it's even a good idea to bring it up in that way to say, oh, are you interested in doing something like Green Mondays, or do you want to do Default Veg? And having both of those options sometimes gives people more like they feel like they have a choice and they're like, oh, I like, this one will work better for us. And maybe that's, they're more likely to choose to do something if they have options.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, if you know of someone who wants to be a Default Veg ambassador, you can feel free to message me their information right now, or you can just respond to the email that we'll send out later, and I can talk with you about it then, either way.
And then Elizabeth shared some good news there at the end, something good to end on. She went vegan overnight 10 years ago. It's so possible to create change. That's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. It is. And yeah, thank you guys so much. Oh, wait, there might be one more question rolling in, or a couple.
A couple.
More.
I'll answer this one first. What about being a Default Veg ambassador outside the US? Yes, you are more than welcome to be working on this in other countries. We have the UK Veg Society, specifically for in the UK, they're working on it there, so I can connect you with them. But in all other countries, I'm happy to work with folks there as well. So if you know someone that is in another country that would want to do it, feel free to let them know about it. And then what are some of Default Veg's biggest success stories in the Bay Area or just in general? So I'll share with you a couple, and then just a little bit of history with Default Veg is that the idea has been around for a couple of years. It was actually started in the UK. We brought it to the US about a year ago, but we officially relaunched and started all of our outreach in January of this year. And then right as we were planning a bunch of events for later this year, we were supposed to be working with the American Medical Student Association on their big convention they were supposed to have in April, which has obviously been postponed to next year. So right now we're just having a lot of conversations with groups about incorporating Default Veg as their policy for all of their events moving forward, or trying to work with them early on 2021. But I'll share two examples. One is I met someone who worked with the American Lung Association last year at a conference, and she thought this would be great. And so they did a Default Veg event as a buffet style for one of their events. And she said, nobody had complaints, everybody loved the food, and they included a little blurb about why they want Default Veg for their mission in the pamphlet, and she announced it as well. So that's a good example. And there's also a Jewish co-working community in Chicago where I actually attend, who I've come to present there a few times, and they decided to adopt Default Veg as their policy for all of their events. So they have events a few times a month for, networking events or holidays, and they always have Default Veg. They always put up a little sign to explain it. And what's happened is all of the other groups that work there have also now become interested in the idea and are interested in doing that for their future events. And again, people love the food and they love the idea. And so we really hope that the more and more people we're able to connect with for Default Veg, that the idea will just sort of become like a cultural concept, and the idea of normalizing plant-based eating will become normal, and hopefully that'll turn some things around. If that answered your question.
Great. And I see one more comment in the chat from Elizabeth talking about reaching out to culinary arts training programs. Do you have any experience doing that, Alana or Hannah?
I don't yet, but it's definitely something we'd be willing to do. I end up with a lot more success if there's somebody in the program themselves or at the head of the program that is interested in this idea. So if you know of anybody who would be open to something like this, that's maybe in a program themselves or helps with planning them, definitely let me know their contact information and I'm happy to reach out to them.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. These type of programs do very well, or I should say they do much better if it comes from an internal person. So it's not as frequent that it's me or someone from staff reaching out and saying you should do this, because when that happens, it's coming from an external source, and the people who make these decisions, they don't know if their community actually wants this, and then they're less likely to get it moving. So yeah, definitely if you know someone in any of these facilities that you're interested in, whether it's a training program or a university or a business, feel free to reach out to one of us or both of us directly, and we're happy to get connected. I don't think we've ever worked with a training facility. I know I've spoken with a culinary school about the idea of implementing more education about plant-based cooking. And we're always with the work that FFAC does, which is a little bit of a divestment from this discussion, but they go in and they do an educational presentation about factory farming. So that is also an option if you feel like maybe the students or the staff just need more awareness. That's another way of going about that as well, and following an educational event like a presentation of that sort, then we can connect them to the idea of Green Monday or Default Veg or whatever you want to call it, to help educate and bring that into the school as well. That was a great question.
Okay, great. It looks like that's the end of the questions. I don't see any more comments. So we'll close it right there, but thank you to everybody. Yeah, thank you, Hannah and Alana. That was great information. And we'll send out a recording to everyone that attended too, if you want to review this information. So all that information will be coming soon. But thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.